Stephen Lawrence, welcome into the weeds, brother.
Mate, it's good to be here. I've been waiting for this moment.
You should have been waiting, mate. I'm ready to ambush you with all the tricky questions.
Oh, jeez.
But you like, I can't believe you're 50 years old. You're pretty well preserved. You look about 32. Can't have done any work.
That's a
or been
great
in the
start, mate. You're trying to lull me into a false sense of security or what?
that's how I ingratiate myself with some compliments. But real, like, you're 50 years old. I can't believe it. We're the same age. I'm worried about
you're 52, are you?
I'm 51, yeah. You're 75, I'm 73.
Okay.
Yeah, there you go. But you've packed a lot into your life. It's ridiculous. I've been trying to keep it in my head for this afternoon. You're like New South Wales. You're Macquarie Street's answer to Jeffrey Robertson, really, aren't you? You're a crusading lawyer and an activist in the law, in politics. But it was always going to be that way. You are a product of your upbringing. You come from a long line of proud trade unionists, Labor members. You really didn't have much choice about your value system and who you've become, did you?
Mate, it's funny you say that because I remember when I first stood for election for the Labor Party in 2015, you had to fill out a form, like I can't remember what it was called, like statement of intent or something. And you had to outline your association with the Labor Party, basically, and the trade union movement. And I sat down, I sort of spoke to my mum because I knew that we had some sort of Labor connections and stuff, and sort of wrote it all out. And then I looked at it and thought, wow, I actually really do have a very strong family connection to this party. And
like great-grandfather started a trade union or one of the first affiliated trade unions?
There was a few things not in my inaugural too, like Dorothy Tanguy who was the first woman to be in the Senate for the Labor Party. She was my mum's second cousin or first cousin removed or something like that.
It's in the genes. Most people, when you actually start talking to them about who they are and their values and where they came from, it's like most people who are a political activist have someone, in their past who's a suffragette or started a riot or a political party or whatever it is. And your grandparents as well, very active and like lifelong members of the Labor Party.
Yeah, so on both sides, both my grandfathers were in the Labor Party as well as various aunts and uncles and different people and people working for unions. One of my aunties was an organiser for the nurses, my uncle for the PSA. And then, my great-grandfather on my dad's side, on my dad's side started the Merchant Officers Guild, which was a sort of prominent trade union that ultimately sort of merged into another union. But, it's funny. Like, we all like to think that we arrive at our views and positions through kind of intellectual processes, but you sort of, stop and look back at a certain point and you realise that you're the product of a whole lot of influences and family values and things passed down to you.
I wonder if there's a genetic imprint. No, it's just not your hair colour. It's just the way you skew politically when you're confronted with ideas. It's an interesting point.
It is.
And you were pretty political from a young age. You grew up in the eastern suburbs. Well, born in Griffith.
Yeah, born in Griffith.
1975. So country New South Wales, strong connections there, but pretty much grew up in the idyllic and background of the eastern suburbs of Sydney, Coogee. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so born in Griffith because my dad was out there working as a health administrator. He was the CEO of the hospital there. And then when I was 2 or 3, we moved to Wollongong. He took up a similar position in Wollongong. And then I come from a family of 5. We lived in Wollongong until I was 9. So I started year 4 in Sydney and we're living in Little Bay, which we were living in the premises of Prince Henry Hospital, which is now long closed down, but was a big teaching hospital in this really sort of beautiful part of southeast Sydney. So, I had this amazing idyllic childhood where we lived in the grounds of the hospital and people who know that area will know that it's sort of surrounded by national parks and golf courses, and it's a really
Little Bay and all of that
Little
area.
Bay's, part
Beautiful.
of it. So we just grew up with living in this amazing place with total freedom, basically. Like I just remember from that age, pretty much of 9, 10, 11, we just roamed around on the weekends. We were free to leave home in the morning as long as we came home by sunset. And there was lots of other kids living there as well.
Skinning your knees and breaking things and...
Oh, the things we did, honestly, like I wouldn't let my son do them now, like rock climbing up big cliffs and swimming in these dangerous, choppy parts of, the rock faces there and all sorts of things. Yeah. So, I had a really idyllic childhood with really amazing parents and a really good group of brothers and sisters, and very lucky.
You were very lucky, but you make your own luck too in life. And I like the story of you. You were were you handing out for Laurie Brereton as like an 18-year-old?
93.
93. So like you're pretty indoctrinated. I was handing out for the Democrats back then. The Democrats, and then they eventually sort of became the group. I was indoctrinated in the sort of environmental politics, but you're there handing out for Laurie Brereton, he was a legend of the New South Wales Labor Party, Labor Right. Very strong Catholic tradition, which has been, you say that you're very proud of your Catholic tradition. Your mum was a Catholic school teacher, and you think the church has been a force for good in your life and generally?
Yeah, I do. So we were, raised in the Catholic tradition, and I remember my mum telling us many times that you've got to go to church every week until you're 18, and then you can make your own decisions. And though sometimes we managed to sort of skip off and do different things, but went to Antioch at Malabar for a number of years, and at the time I never really sort of. Yeah, my dad, though he was raised as a Catholic, I think broadly was not so much of a believer as my mum. So we always had those two influences. And especially as a young person, I was, not really religious. I sort of went because I was forced to go, I guess. But as I get older, I look back on it all and think about faith and religion and the world, and actually feel really grateful that I was raised in that tradition, and that those morals and values were a part of my growing up.
So it had a big influence on you. Your dad was you came to really appreciate, because he was a very successful civil servant, public servant. You recognised, that was an incredibly important job in society, and you recognised the value of that pretty early on as well.
Yeah, totally. And I talk in my inaugural speech about how my dad was a senior health administrator. So when he first moved to Sydney, he was the CEO of the area health service, and an amazing man. A little story that I tell in that same speech is that I was working as a paper boy in the hospital back in 86, 87, and there was an HIV AIDS ward then there, and I think it was set up then at that time. That's how I recall it. And there was this controversy from the point of view of the kiosk, which was the little shop that I worked for, about whether the paper boys and girls could go into the AIDS ward, basically, because we used to walk through all of the wards of a morning. It was quite incredible when I think back. We'd sort of trundle right through the middle of the ward. Everyone's asleep and we're singing out papers, papers, papers. Anyway, there was this controversy about whether we should be in the AIDS ward or not. And my dad as CEO, basically got involved in that question, and ultimately those people were able to access that service and were able to go there, which, when I think back on it, is just a little thing, but I think an important thing, and it just showed the progressive values that he brought to his role. And,
well, you were copying it from everywhere. Your mum with her values, the Labor Party values, your dad. I mean, that was a really important time. My aunt worked on the St. Vincent's. She was a matron on this and an administrator in the St. Vincent's aid ward. And she was like, when she would, and this was in the mid-'80s, and when she told people that she was working in there, they'd stop talking to her. Yeah. Like they'd literally run away. They were going to catch something, and oh my God. So, that's a pretty strong position to take from a dad. to a young kid out there, but very strong Labor values. I mean, it's in your DNA, mate. You're born to be the Attorney General somewhere. Don't tell Michael Daly. But you ended up doing law. Why is it? Because you're passionate about the law. You're passionate about so many elements of the judicial system. But why, as a young man, did you turn to the law?
Yeah, so I didn't initially. I did an arts degree after I finished school, and I didn't actually go that well in my HSC. Like, I couldn't have gone straight into law. I wasn't a very good student. Wasn't very focused at school, and but then I finished my arts degree. Started in '93, finished it end of '96, and then I moved to Darwin in 1997, and I moved up there for a couple of different reasons, but my sister moved up there with her boyfriend, and I sort of followed them up there. And then I worked at Pass Bailey Pearls for a while, spent a few months up there on the pearl farms. And then in the beginning of '98, I applied to do law, and I got in at the University of Western Sydney and Charles Darwin University. So I stayed up in Darwin and did my first year of law up there.
God, you sound like Errol Flynn. What were you doing, working on the pearl farm? And a pirate? Put us a little bit of pirate. What were you, diving for pearls?
No, we were doing basically, so these
modelling
pearl
the pearls?
No, what we were doing was these pearls are growing inside, like, I think it's the Mississippi clamshell, but they put them inside steel cages, and then the cages hang in the water underneath these sort of buoys and ropes and stuff. So we were working on like a little boat that would go up and down the lines and basically pull the steel cages out of the water and then check they were right, clear them, clean these sort of things off that would grow on them and stuff, clear the weed off, and then put them back in. And yeah, it was pretty interesting. We were in this little part of the northwest of WA, Vansittart Bay, which I remember some years after that, a boatload of refugees arrived there. And it was the first and last time that I heard Vansittart Bay talked about in the media or whatever, but it's an incredibly remote part of WA.
Imagine turning up on your fishing trawler and just running it aground. We've made it to Australia.
And it's the middle of nowhere,
and
mate.
It's like 300 kilometres.
See crocodiles. We saw tiger sharks because we lived on a boat. And when we would throw scraps off the end of the boat, tiger sharks would come along, but regularly we'd see crocodiles closer to the shore. An amazing place. The nearest sort of human civilization was Columbaroo, which I think was like 300 kilometres away or something. Incredibly remote and beautiful place. And, mate, it was just so lucky to have that time to spend there. Like, I remember one time there was a bushfire burning on the coast, and it burnt for the whole of that sort of shift because we used to do 2 weeks on, a week off. So for 2 weeks, we just watched this fire slowly burn up and down the coast, and no one would sort of come and put it out or stop it. It's just a extremely remote place.
Probably no one ever knew it had happened apart from you.
Yeah.
Amazing place, amazing place. And so a bit of life experience. You got out there, manual labour. I mean, after I was at school, I did a little bit of work on a salmon farm, actually, sort of similar, feeding the salmon pens. So yeah, that was an eye opener on like how we farm salmon, which is a bit of an issue at the moment.
Yeah, I've seen that.
Yeah, and yeah, well, that was pretty rugged working on some salmon farms down there in Tasmania. But you ended up after that doing law.
Yep.
And you became a practicing lawyer. And took a job on pretty early working as a special prosecutor down in the ACT, prosecuting domestic violence. So some people go and, do conveyancing and they, started a little quiet suburban, but you got straight into the teeth of it. Tell us about that and being a prosecutor.
Yeah, so out of uni, I actually got my first job in the Federal Attorney General's Department. And I worked there for about 18 months, and a large part of that was in the International Extradition Unit. So I actually worked on the tail end of the Skase case, for example. So it was a incredibly...
The chase for Skase.
The chase for Skase. He actually died when I was working in that unit.
Wasn't he in Mallorca and pulling on like, I've got kidney failure and I'm in a wheelchair.
And there was a lot of skepticism about it all, but then he died. And it was a funny old day in the office because it had consumed a lot of resources, that case. It was an outgoing extradition request, so we weren't doing the litigation in Australia like we did for the incoming requests, instructing solicitors and so forth. But it's still very resource intensive. And I remember working on memos for the minister's office about that case, and it was obviously highly controversial. So that was interesting, but I was really drawn to the courtroom. I just wanted to get into courtroom stuff. The whole time at uni, I'd wanted to work in criminal law basically, and just saw myself doing that work. So this opportunity came up to work at the DPP and the ACT.
What was it about the courtroom? Like, because I always found it very compelling, but just this arcane sort of impenetrable language, this process that I found, well, I still do. I've been in a couple of cases, and I just don't know. The rhythm of it is so strange, but what was it about it that really drew you to it? Was it the adversarial approach, or was it just the blood sport of it?
Man, I think it's a few different things. I think I was drawn to the idea of defending a person, right? Like being the person whose job it is to defend someone, and sort of always understood that to be a really special role. But I think I also had this view, which maybe was a misconception or not a misconception, but maybe kind of reaches a use-by date, which is that would be a vehicle for me to work on social justice issues. And I wanted to be a defence lawyer originally, but I was just putting around for jobs and got a job in the DPP.
So you wanted to stand up for people and stand up against a bully, be it, a perpetrator or the state.
Yep.
And that really, that really floated your boat.
Yeah, it did. And it's funny because a lot of people would think about that role more as a defence lawyer's role, I suppose. But I really conceived of that job, and it really motivated me as a prosecutor because I did specialise for a significant part of my time there in domestic violence matters. And you get a range of cases in DV, and it's something that my experiences there have really led me to resist a lot of the caricatures that you sort of fed or hear about domestic violence. It's not all one-dimensional. Not all the cases are the same. There's lots of different types of perpetrators and victims. And obviously in criminal law, you're there first and foremost to work out who actually is a perpetrator as opposed to an accused, and it's an important distinction.
And the type of crime they're committing, because it's a massive spectrum of crimes, from some of the most egregious crimes to others that should they be crimes at all?
Yeah, and look, in the criminal law, that's a really common issue, which is the issue isn't just are they guilty of something. The issue often in the criminal law is what exactly are they guilty of, and that's often highly disputed and really complex part of cases.
But tough work too. Like you're dealing with, you never shrank from that, because sometimes you would have been dealing with, just people's lives falling apart, violent assaults, photos of terrible things that have happened. You never shrank from that. You always leant into it. You never thought, gee, this is going to, give me nightmares.
Mate, not at that point, to be honest. I found when I was a young practitioner that I had an almost kind of insurmountable kind of capacity to absorb traumatic things. So I didn't shy away from the work at that point in time. And you're right, a lot of it was violent and gruesome, but even more stressful the most stressful thing I remember about DV prosecutions is this phenomena of retraction. So you would get involved in a case, and because we were doing best practice stuff, so you'd get involved early, you try and keep the same prosecutor throughout the whole proceedings. You try to build a relationship with the complainant. And what would very commonly happen, almost as often as it didn't happen, was the person would change their mind about the proceedings and want to withdraw from them. So a big part of that job was talking to people about why they wanted to retract and ultimately making a decision about whether the proceedings should be dropped because they essentially had changed their mind. Now, sometimes people might...
Did people change their mind and their story, or just say, look, my story's true, but I've changed my mind about how I feel about this person that I'm accusing, or about going through with the process?
It's a mixture of both. Yeah. So you'd often get, I just don't want this proceeding to go ahead because I love him, or I've moved on from it, or something like that. Or very commonly you might get, I lied to begin with and now I want the case dropped. And sometimes you even might get something like a stat deck's been done through the solicitors for the accused, and then is sent to you, and simply the lawyers for the accused are basically running the show in that sense. But very commonly in all those different situations, what you would discern as the prosecutor, not always, but you would often form the view yourself, and ultimately it's not for you to decide if they're guilty or not, but you'd form the view that, look, this person's been bashed and mistreated and they're changing their mind either because they're scared or because they want the relationship to continue, or sometimes a mixture of things, which might include much more practical considerations, like he's the breadwinner, he's the father of the children, this is ruining our family and ruining our lives. So it's a very complicated set of circumstances, but that was probably the most stressful thing.
You're doing this 20 years ago.
Yeah.
This is 20 years ago, and this is when before, like, there's been so much more recently in terms of, you know, how abhorrent and widespread domestic violence is and how we really need to focus on policing it and eliminating it. And you were there 20 years ago working on best practice in terms of prosecutions and the rest. So you were straight in at the deep end.
Yeah, well, the ACT led the way pretty much. So the ACT adopted some of the American models of best practice pretty early. And it was called the Family Violence Intervention Project in the ACT. It started a couple of years before I got there, I think, and it was ultimately award-winning. So we were doing a lot of what would now be commonly seen as best practice, which is why when I ended up coming to New South Wales, I was just horrified by the aspects in which I arrived in New South Wales in terms of practicing criminal law here in 2010 in Western New South Wales, and was just appalled by how far it fell short of that best practice that I'd seen in the ACT.
We'll get to your work in Western New South Wales with the ALS and other things, but because for light relief after doing that in the ACT, you decide to go to the Solomon Islands.
Yes.
So you head to the Solomon Islands in 2004. It's one of the most socially disadvantaged places on earth, and it's rife with corruption and violence. What the fuck were you doing in the Solomon Islands? Why did you go there?
So Australia intervened in the Solomon Islands in mid-2003, the Regional Assistance Mission, known as Ramsey. And basically we sent in cops and army, and the police arrested.
There was essentially a civil war going on.
There was a civil war there. So a civil war had started there in 97, 98, and it's a complex thing, but it was ostensibly at least a civil war over land ownership and use. So there's more than two, but of the main islands in Solomon's, Malaita and Guadalcanal are two. The capital is on Guadalcanal. Lots of Malaitan people in the aftermath of World War II and the establishment of the capital there had moved to Guadalcanal. And the capital basically had started to spill into the hinterland, basically. The population had started to spread into the Guadalcanal plains. And that ultimately led to big tensions over land use. And then Bougainville started in the 90s.
Which was, again, a civil war, and that was a big fight over mineral resources, essentially, wasn't it?
That's right.
Who was going to control a gigantic copper mine?
Yep, and an independence movement, right?
Yeah.
So, Melanesian people are taking up arms around land use issues, and Bougainville is part of the Solomons archipelago. So this sort of this political movement in Bougainville, I think this is part of the genesis of the Solomons War, spilled into Guadalcanal, and indeed some of the Guadalcanal Revolutionary Army people who I was involved in their cases, some of them were half Bougainvillean or part Bougainvillean, so there were some family links as well. But anyway, this sort of started in the late 90s. As the Asian financial crisis is happening, the state in the Solomons is essentially collapsing, ceasing to provide a lot of the services that it had. And the police became very weak. And then eventually this GRA started. It changed its name over time, but originally the GRA or the IFM, I think, might have been one of the early names. And they, in this period leading up to 2000, evicted all the Malaitan settlers out of the plains and drove them into Honiara. And then the Malaitans formed a group in response, the Malaita Eagle Force. They had a coup in mid-2000. There was then this period of sort of outright conflict. There was then the Townsville Peace Agreement in late 2000, I think, that kind of worked for a few years, but this Harold Keke, that had been one of the main Guadalcanal leaders, he maintained his own little insurgency on the southern part of Guadalcanal and started to commit really serious atrocities, particularly in 2003. And that's when people in Solomons and Australia started this push to get an intervention force, basically.
Because, for kids playing at home, like Guadalcanal and Solomons had been, one of the, there's a lot of intergenerational trauma there because it had been like one of the most pivotal battlegrounds of World War II. I mean, the place is just still literally covered in the detritus of the Battle of the Coral Sea. There's also the island Guadalcanal was a huge battleground between the US and the Japanese. There was a lot of arms there. There's still a lot of munitions.
Mate, people die on a regular basis there.
There's just bombs everywhere.
Like unexploded munitions that they dig up in their backyard and people die. There was a foreign correspondent show on it recently. I think it was last year. Can't remember the amount of people dying, but it's a regular thing in Honiara. Explosions happen.
People just get legs and arms blown off, just, hanging out the washing or, trying to do some gardening or some building. So a lot of disadvantage. And you decide to put your head right in the middle of it.
Yeah, so this job came up and
this job came up.
Yeah, this job came up. So they were advertising for lawyers because we'd sent police over there. They'd arrested hundreds, maybe thousands of people, including former militant leaders, politicians, lots of police, because the police were right in the thick of the conflict. So they
for very
lawyers.
violent crimes, like for war crimes, atrocities. Yeah.
So I got the job, and I still remember the moment that I got the email or the phone call saying you've got the job, and just being so happy and excited about this opportunity to do this work that just seemed so interesting and exotic and in a different country. And I just felt, mate, so lucky to be paid to do a job like that because it just seemed so interesting and made it transpired to be even more interesting than what I would have thought.
I bet. So tell us about it. Tell us about Honiara, because it must have been because I've been to Vanuatu and I've stayed in some resorts, but I've been out to some of the outer islands too. It is, it's only 3 hours by plane away from Brisbane, but it is another universe. It really is. It's like it is, in terms of disadvantage, it's down there with anything you'd find in, like the most disadvantaged parts of Africa, a lot of violence and a pretty unsafe place. But you've popped in there. You're a prosecutor. You're going.
Defence lawyer.
You're a defence lawyer. So you're a
public defender.
So you were defending some of the people on the on some of these really serious war crimes. How does that go? You pop in the cell. There must have been a language barrier, a cultural barrier.
Yeah, there was. Yeah. So I still remember landing there and getting my boss picked me up at the airport, Ken Affair, who was the public solicitor, who was an English fellow. He's now in Sydney working as a barrister. But he picked me up and drove me to the office or to my hotel first. And I remember that trip from the airport and thinking exactly what you've just said, which is, I just can't believe somewhere so poor is so close to Australia because on that Human Development Index, it's down there with sub-Saharan Africa basically. And quite extraordinary that this place is so close to a place like Australia. And I really think we need to do more to economically integrate these places with us, not necessarily because of all the geostrategic stuff, but just on
a justice and
a social justice
level.
Issue.
Yeah.
But anyway, so I was working in the public solicitor's office, which was essentially the legal aid office of the Solomon Islands. It's recognised in the Constitution, the public solicitor's office. And that little office, which had its main office in Honiara, but also some small provincial offices, basically had this massive influx of foreign lawyers who came in to do these trials. And our local colleagues were, just amazing people, many of whom had worked in that organisation for a long time, including through this period of civil war where the state effectively ceased to operate properly. And I often think back to how tolerant they were of us just sort of turning up in their country and, taking these roles in the office, being much better paid than them. Like sort of astronomically better paid, and just how
Or
generous
paid at
they
all,
were.
probably.
Yeah, I mean the government wages over there, whether you're a police officer or a lawyer in working in a government role, it's not good at all. But yeah, so I basically turn up, and all of these tension trials, which is what they called them, the ethnic tension trials, were basically just about to start at the time that I arrived, and the files just got farmed out, and we just went up to Rove, which was the prison, and met our clients. I did other trials as well. I did lots of sort of law and order murders, so not ones linked to the war, and lots of fraud and corruption cases, represented lots of police, all sorts of different things, but spent most of my time in these conflict-related trials, many of which had many accused in them. So I remember one trial I did that had 6 or 7. There were some trials with more, sometimes 10, 11. In terms of the language stuff.
And you're defending all of them, eh?
No, normally one in a serious matter. Yeah, there might have been a couple of matters where you might get more than one, but it's pretty difficult in a murder trial to be sure that there won't be a conflict of interest, for example. So it tended to be one-on-one. And we got some pidgin lessons. Pidgin English is like the language that is common over there to everyone, though everyone's got their own language as well. It's a very sort of culturally complex place. But you just went up to the jail, met the client. They were facing a mandatory life sentence if they were found guilty.
No death penalty in Solomon's?
No death penalty. No.
But mandatory life.
They've since all of this happened, they've introduced a sort of license or parole system, I think. But at that time, there was no system like that. So it was mandatory life. And there's still people from that conflict who lost their trials that are still in jail today. So it was a very serious matter. And you were dealing with clients who, generally were not educated. Most of them probably couldn't read and write. A lot of them were village people that got swept up in this insurgency. So,
and some of the matters you were dealing with were super serious, weren't they? You were talking about like mass executions and things like that. Tell us about that one. Tell us the one.
Yeah. So one case, the first conflict-related trial I did was the murder of Brother Sardo, and it's an incredible story, which was basically Brother Sardo was a Melanesian brother. That's like the sort of Church of England over there. And Harold Keke, who was the main Guadalcanal sort of militant leader who was not part of the Townsville Peace Agreement in 2000, so continued to operate until the intervention. He was occupying the Weather Coast area, which is the southern part of Guadalcanal, the rough sort of part of the coast. And Brother Sardo went down on a peace mission, basically, to sort of make contact with Harold. And Harold captured him. He was held in the roots of an abalolo tree, which is a sort of type of tree over there, where they sort of keep pigs in the roots of this tree. It's got a big root system. And
I've seen one in Vanuatu.
Yeah, amazing things.
Gigantic tree, and this one these people were living in.
Yeah,
they just had it set up as a sort of hangout. But gigantic, like Moreton Bay fig times 200.
Yeah, and they sort of turned it into a little prison, and they put sort of wire and mesh and stuff to keep him in there. Ultimately, he was executed, and then 6 other Melanesian brothers came down searching for him. And this was all preceded, I should have said, by the kidnapping of Augustine Geve, who was a cabinet minister and a priest who'd been murdered before Brother Sardo, as I remember it. Anyway, the 6 Melanesian brothers then went down to find Brother Sardo. They were captured and then all murdered. So I did that trial of Brother Sardo's case. I then did the appeal for one of the fellows that was convicted.
And so who were you defending in that? Were you defending Keke in that? Or
I was defending, in Brother Sardo, I was defending a young guy called Willie. I won't use his surname. And then in the 6 Melanesian brothers appeal, I was representing, can't remember if there was 2 brothers in it. It was one of the 2 brothers who were convicted of it. And we ended up winning the Brother Sardo matter on appeal, but the people convicted of the 6 Melanesian brothers, their convictions against appeal failed. But a big part of the Sardo trial, which was a common feature in lots of these trials, was the admissibility of records of interview. Because what basically happened was when they arrested all of these people, it was kind of this interesting fusion of this Australian intervention with Solomon Islands policing. So like Ronnie Cower, Harold Keke, lots of the other leaders of the GLF and sort of active militants all got captured by Australian Army basically and put onto an Australian ship and then taken to Honiara. And then they participated by and large, almost all of them, in lengthy police interviews and admitted to multiple murders. So then it was then our job to basically...
Probably without a lawyer there.
They generally had a lawyer there and generally had some legal advice. But the sort of problem was, from their point of view, this was kind of like a peace process. And, you know, they understood this to be the end of this civil conflict. So there was a lot of arguments that we put forward with a mixture of success. We got a whole lot of them thrown out of evidence. But this argument we were advancing was basically it was a fusing of these two processes that meant that their admissions weren't voluntary when you judge them against the sort of criteria and standards of the common law, because the common law says a lot about voluntariness of admissions and has a really strict rule about not admitting admissions unless the court can be satisfied that it was voluntarily given and that there was no inducements that preceded it.
Or you're sitting in the bowels of an Australian warship while you...
That was, that was part of the argument. And these AFP officers who by and large did it were very skillful interviewers and complied generally, though not always, complied generally with the formulas and sort of said the right words. But what all of that meant from the perspective of someone that had just come out of years in the jungle in an armed conflict and had absolutely no understanding of English, couldn't read and write. So we got a lot of those interviews excluded from evidence. And
But tough stuff, like tough place to be living, tough place to be working, and tough subject matter because, you know, you build a relationship with these people, their lives are on the line. And so very difficult. And then it blows up. Literally, there's an insurgency, isn't there?
Oh, the riots. You mean?
Yeah, the riots.
Yeah.
So tell us about that. You're living in Honiara, and then the place there's a conflagration. What happened?
Yeah, so this was April 2006, and there was an election in sort of March, April 2006, and a new government or a new set of MPs elected. And they've got a system over there where they have the election and then the MPs meet as a group in Parliament House and elect the Prime Minister. And then the Prime Minister sort of forms the government after that. So they have this period between the declaration of the poll and the election of the Prime Minister. It's about 2 weeks, I think. And what they traditionally do is the different groups that are trying to form the government each choose a hotel in Honiara and they'll all live in that hotel. And then they'll lobby and try to entice people from the other groups to come to their hotel.
Really?
And sort of form into their group. So that happened in that period, and a fellow called Snyderini was elected as Prime Minister. And there was immediately a mass outbreak of rioting and looting. And I remember and we had some warnings that there could be civil unrest and stuff on that day, but I remember being in the office and we sort of got a directive that we should all go home. And I got in my car and drove up the main road. And you sort of go up the main road towards what's called Point Cruz, which is like in the middle of Honiara. And the Parliament's up on a hill to the left. And I just remember this huge mob of people just come down this hill and roaring up the main street towards my car, kind of carrying different things and all this crazy stuff happening. So I turned around at the roundabout, which happened to be just there, and went home. And it was just the beginning of this sort of crazy week where the town got destroyed. I lived sort of west of that main CBD area, but opposite a very large hotel and casino. And that all just got razed and burnt to the ground.
Did you ever fear for your safety?
Mate, I did this very, in retrospect, stupid thing, which was that on the night, I think of the Wednesday, which was when most of the destruction was caused to Chinatown, my neighbour was this Australian guy called Josh, who had grown up in the Solomons, spoke perfect pidgin, his parents were scrap metal people. So there was this big industry after World War II. I think it might have kicked off in the 60s or 70s in the Solomons. Very significant industry of getting all the scrap metal out of all the old American and Japanese boats and then selling it.
What did they call? What did they call it? The alley. There was where they had the Battle of the Coral Sea. I think there was more Navy ships sunk there.
Probably Iron Bottom Sound.
Iron Bottom Sound.
So we lived on Iron Bottom Sound, basically.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, Honiara was on it.
Because there was destroyers and cruisers and battleships and
it's an incredible place.
Hundreds of thousands of tons of naval vessels, all sitting on the bottom of the and they're all just sitting down there, slowly rusting and leaking oil, aren't they?
And most of them you can't ever see. Like obviously diving's really popular there, and divers will have heard of it. But the ones you can dive on are like 5%, as I understand it. The vast majority of them are in the depths of Iron Bottom Sound, and no one will ever really see them again. Anyway, Josh had grown up in the Solomons. He was an Australian guy because his parents were in that industry. But anyway, he was my neighbour at the time. And we're all at home watching the smoke off in the distance as the CBD burns and there's mobs everywhere. And he goes, mate, let's walk into town and see what's happening.
Bullshit.
And mate, it seemed like a good idea at the time.
Oh my God.
Anyway, so we walk into town.
I think the mobs are like setting things on fire. And, you know, there's a bit of a penchant in some of these islands for machetes.
I saw some machetes.
Yeah, like leg length machetes.
So mate, we walk up the main street and then you sort of turn to the left into Chinatown, which is traditionally where rioters go and destroy things in Honiara. And it's a regular thing. Probably every few years there's some sort of attack on Chinatown. Anyway, it's sort of evening by this time and we walk into Chinatown and mate, it was like the apocalypse. Like I will never forget it. There was literally, you know, electricity poles falling down, building being razed to the ground, looted, large buildings on fire. It was just a hectic, crazy, incredible thing. But mate, this is a testament to the people of Solomon Islands because two white guys, I mean, Josh is very well known in Honiara because he was an Australian and grown up there. It's a small town. Never a threat to us, never a hostile word. We just walked through and then we went to the Honiara Hotel, or the road where the Honiara Hotel is, and then we walked around and looped back and went home. But never a hostile word. No one threatened us. And
what about where was the ADF? Were they there? Like, how come this got out of hand? How come this wasn't sort of suppressed?
So what? Yeah, that's an interesting question. So the Ramsay police had been at the Parliament at the time of the vote for the election of the Prime Minister. And I know all this pretty well because I subsequently appeared in the criminal trial of the people accused of orchestrating it. They had a security presence there. They did deploy tear gas at the point where the crowd started to get unruly. And in retrospect, that's actually what set the crowd off.
Yeah, right.
Though that said, there was a very substantial allegation that the whole thing had been orchestrated. So that theory about, you know, the Ramsay police sparking it was sort of pretty contentious. Because the other theory, which was sort of the theory of the prosecution in the trial ultimately, was that former Malaita Eagle Force leaders, certain of whom might appear for in cases, who'd been charged with criminal offences after Ramsay came, had wanted Sogavare, who was the other sort of choice. They'd wanted him to be elected as Prime Minister and that they saw political advantage for them in terms of amnesties and so forth if he was elected. And so they orchestrated the riot on this case in order to overthrow Snyderini and get Sogavare in, who would then take care of them. So there was different sort of theories of these events. But one theory was that Ramsay trying to stop the crowd had sort of set them off and then they went down into Point Cruz, ultimately to Chinatown. But anyway, what happened over that week was...
biennial riot.
It's pretty common there, but this was a particularly severe one. I mean, they razed Chinatown to the ground.
Did anyone die?
No, no one died in that one. Someone died in one about 5 or 6 years after that. I remember a whole lot of people died in one. So they have had fatal consequences. And it's a miracle no one did because Chinatown was razed to the ground, as was very other significant parts of Honiara. But anyway, I stayed there throughout that. And there was an evacuation of Australians at the time, which was demanded by certain expats who were working there. And I'll never forget a phone call with Craig Ewers, who was the head of the Law and Justice Project. because he sort of had the job of ringing around, and he rang me and he goes, "Oh, mate, there's a Hercules coming in. If you want to leave, you can leave." And I said, "Oh, mate, I won't be leaving. I don't feel in danger at all." And then he said to me, "Mate, I'm so glad that you're not leaving." And he said a few things to me about his perspective on, people that are paid a lot of money because it is an unstable environment and are doing important work in terms of the long-term stability of the country, and how when we're making assessments of whether we stay or we go, we should definitely take into account all of those things, i.e. he didn't think that we should be leaving. And anyway, so I stayed and ended up representing, there was hundreds of people arrested sort of in that week, and I did a lot of bail court for people in this sort of mass arrest context. But then ultimately, ended up acting for Nelson Ney, who's now passed away, who was an MP who was accused of being involved in this conspiracy basically to set off this riot if their guy wasn't elected. And then spent most of 07.
Did you get him off?
Yeah, he was found not guilty. Yep. Yeah, so I spent most of 07 basically involved in all of these riot-related trials. So still did some conflict-related stuff, but the riot one was a really long trial, went for sort of 8 months or something, and then ultimately left the Solomons, beginning of 2008.
It's a funny place, the Solomon Islands, because it's, as you say, it's this socioeconomic backwater, but it's geopolitically just so important, and we see the Chinese with their Belt and Road sort of soft diplomacy turning up and offering to build bridges and highways and schools and all the rest of it. Was any of that going on when you were there? Was it like was a hotbed of political intrigue, different spooks from different places?
Mate, very much so. So it's interesting, this issue about the Solomons recognising the People's Republic and all of the geostrategic things that are relevant to that, that was one part of the 2006 riot. So I ended up acting for a short time for Julian Motti, who'd been appointed as the Attorney General of Solomon Islands by Sogavare after the riot. And he was sort of public enemy number one in terms of the Australian government and the Regional Assistance Mission. And he had a very clear view that he wanted to get rid of Ramsay. He wanted amnesty for all the militants who were being prosecuted. He wanted an independent sort of courts of the Solomon Islands. Sogavare certainly wanted that. And that government wanted to recognise China. And the litigation, because he was ultimately prosecuted in Australia, because when he was the Attorney General, when he was about to be appointed, Australia issued warrants for a child sex tourism matter involving him in Vanuatu that he'd had dismissed in Vanuatu. And
really? And they had him extradited?
And that was ultimately stayed by the High Court, and documents came out in that litigation that showed that they reinstituted those proceedings because they feared him becoming the Attorney General and feared that it would be the end of Ramsay, basically, the end of the regional mission. It's very well publicised in the Australian press, very interesting, but what came out in the course of all of that, and I was sort of privy to some of this when I represented him, because he was then the Attorney General while I was a lawyer there, and I knew him and we used to talk a bit, and they wanted to recognise China back then, basically, was the pretty common understanding. So Sogavare was then overthrown in a no confidence motion at the end of 07, so didn't recognise China. I think if he'd stayed in power at that time, he probably would have. So that issue sort of goes back 20 years, if not more, basically, recognition of China. And now they've done it, obviously. And I think Sogavare was Prime Minister when they did it. So he had that long-term plan. And look, it's obviously a really contentious issue here, but my point of view on it, mate, I think the Solomons would be crazy if they didn't play the regional powers and the superpowers off against each other. They're a desperately poor country. They need investment. They need serious infrastructure investment, which is something that China has given them, and we haven't.
If Australia's not doing it and the US isn't doing it, then it's, they need to shop around. And you've got the Chinese Navy just sailing down through there a couple of weeks ago, just stopping through on their way through. Absolutely fascinating. So it's a little bit of like Manchurian Candidate meets, the Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy. are out there in the paradise of the Solomons, and you leave 2007, and somehow, tell me how this happens. You end up in the calm and idyllic surrounds of Palestine.
Palestine. Yeah. So what happened was
You hadn't had enough trauma and intractable problems, so you end up in Palestine setting up what were you setting up? Was it a type of parliament or a...
No. So what it was so I came back from Solomons, went to work in the ACT because I'd come from Canberra, sort of pre-Solomons, worked for Simon Corbell, who was the Attorney General for a while. And then just wanted to get back into the courtroom. I'd wanted to do Aboriginal Legal Service work always, and took a job as a trial advocate at ALS. And then after a year of doing that, the opportunity came up to take leave without pay and do a fellowship at the International Legal Foundation in Ramallah in Palestine, which was basically, I mean, it still exists. It's a very interesting little American NGO who kind of has this theory.
Ramallah, it must be in the West Bank.
It is.
If it still exists.
Yeah, no, it's in the West Bank. It still exists. Yeah, I mean, very tough times there, as well as in Gaza, but yeah, more so in Gaza. But yeah, the ILF's got this theory that that a good criminal defence bar is basically an indispensable part of economic and social development and political development. So they go to all these interesting places, Libya, Nepal, Palestine, all these different places, and set up public defender systems. And the way they do it is get people in for 3-4 month fellowships who are kind of specialists in their home country, and get them to train local lawyers who they recruit. And so I was working in the Palestinian civilian court system.
And it was funny. So you're basically setting up like a legal aid.
Yeah, like a legal aid office.
Legal aid, but this was the ILF doing that.
Yeah.
Wow, amazing.
Mm.
Did they have any infrastructure there, or you were just like starting from zero?
Yeah, they'd set up the Ramallah office. I think it might have been a year or two before I got there. So it was pretty well set up. They had a good little office. They had a little flat that I lived in, sort of on top of the office, in a nice sort of building that had a cafe downstairs where I spent lots of time. And the West Bank's, is kind of like a middle level, I suppose, of economic development. So it wasn't like the Solomons. Lots of restaurants and different things. Got to travel a lot around the West Bank, so up to Jenin, down to Hebron, lots of time in Nablus. Got to know these sort of cities pretty well, which was, really, really cool. And basically got to live.
How are you traveling around? Are you just like walking around? Were you just like...
So in Ramallah...
Did you feel safe?
Mate, it's funny you say that, right? Because the first night I was there, I was talking to my colleague Ali, and because the apartment and the office was probably 2K from like the CBD. And I said to him, "Oh, mate, is it safe for me to walk into the CBD to get dinner?" And he goes, "What do you mean?" And I said, "Is it safe for me to walk into the CBD to get dinner?" He goes, "What do you mean, is it safe?" And I said, "Ali, like if I walk to the CBD to get dinner, is anyone going to attack me or anything like that?" And he goes, "Stephen, nobody here would attack you. You're a visitor. You are a cherished visitor to Palestine. No one would ever attack you." And he was literally offended at the idea that I would get attacked walking up to dinner. So, mate, no. The only danger there, as far as I could discern it, was, outbursts of conflict and the danger that obviously Israel poses to the Palestinians. But yeah, from a sort of day-to-day law and order issue, no, not at all. It's a very, very safe place. Partly because, the Palestinians control what's called Area A. They've got their own sort of police force and so forth. But Area B, Area C, all controlled by Israel. The whole place surrounded by Israel. And
you were in Area A?
Area A.
Yeah, right, okay.
Mm. So
but you went out into Area B and C, and you saw some of that policing going on firsthand?
Yeah. So when you travel basically to any of the main population centres and go around and going to Israel and back, you're travelling through parts of Area B and Area C. And yeah, I would regularly go to Jerusalem. So as an Australian citizen, I could go to Jerusalem, into Israel, back and forth. My Palestinian colleagues could not do that. They're not essentially allowed outside the West Bank. but I could travel freely. The checkpoint nearest to me was Columbia, which is a sort of infamous checkpoint. And yeah, I got to experience a bit of, I suppose, what the Palestinians endure. I remember once sort of entering Columbia, and there's a part of it where you're sort of inside the checkpoint, inside this sort of basically big steel cage, and then the whole thing just shut. And we were all stuck in there and there was like 2 hours we're all in there. And they don't tell you, oh, this is why we've shut the gate and this is how long you'd expect to wait or anything like that. No. Remember another time in Hebron going through a checkpoint, and I'm sort of walking through, and this Israeli soldier's just like screaming at me. I don't know if it was Hebrew or Arabic or what it was. And I couldn't understand. I didn't know what he was telling me to do. Anyway, I eventually got to the other side and spoke to him. And he goes, oh, in this broad American accent, sorry, man, I thought you were an Arab. It's just this, mate, it's the most mind-bending place. Like, it's a very stressful, even though the people were lovely, it's a very stressful and weird and oppressive environment.
You can just feel the tension.
You feel the tension.
When was the electronic intifada? Was there any uprisings or any like outbreaks of violence when you were there?
It was pretty peaceful time. It's probably the wrong word, peaceful, but I remember protests in central Ramallah in the time that I was there. But there was I don't remember. There was definitely things happening in the West Bank at different times, but yeah, I don't remember seeing experience. I remember rocks being thrown at our car. So Israeli settlers will commonly, so you can tell from the license plates on the car whether it's registered in the Palestinian territories or it's Israeli, because some of the roads are shared. I remember settlers throwing stones at our car on one occasion when we were coming back from Jenin, I think it was. But yeah, by and large, yeah.
Did you ever go into any of the settlements?
Refugee camps?
No, like the
Israeli settlements.
Yeah.
No, but they're everywhere. Like if you're in Ramallah, you're looking at a settlement on the nearest hill, sort of thing. All the hilltops are basically settlements, and yeah, everyone's got water tanks there. And I remember I can't remember if it's the Israelis have white ones and the Palestinians have black ones. I can't remember, but you can immediately tell what is a settlement and what is an Arab community, basically. But yeah, so it was an interesting place. But the thing that I love being in Ramallah and spent most of my time there, but going to Jerusalem was just incredible. I just found it to be such an enchanting place, and I went there a lot of weekends. And first few times I went there, just wandered around the old city, basically. It's just like, wow, this is like all from the Bible. This story that you've sort of grown up with. This is where it all happened.
It's real. It's
real. There's like the garden of this and the hills of this and the steps of this. It's all real places. It's amazing.
Fantastic. Wonderful. And so you come back to Australia. You come back to, and you, as you said, you wanted to appear for working for the ALS,
Yep.
Aboriginal Legal Service. In your inaugural speech, you gave a very strong argument for why the ALS should get better funding. It's a critical service like legal aid services, and really needs to be better funded. So you come back, put your money where your mouth is. Did you go? Is that when you moved out to Dubbo?
Yeah, so I moved to Dubbo in 2010. So I came back from the Solomons.
Honiara.
Yep, Honiara, Canberra,
Palestine. Dubbo, how fitting. But another front line, essentially, in a lot of in some of the what I would say was intractable social discord in our society. Some problems that have been ongoing, perpetuated injustice, especially for Aboriginal people. So you go and put yourself there, working for the ALS. Tell us about that. Tell us about Dubbo. You moved out there with your partner and you set up.
Yeah, he didn't come until I think it was 2012 he came. But so I got this job as the trial advocate for the Western region. So based in Dubbo, but doing trial workers council across Western New South Wales. So Wagga, Broken Hill, Burke, any place the district court sat basically, but mainly trials in Dubbo. And I got to work with just an incredible group of criminal lawyers, many of whom are some of my closest friends now. And a real group of talented, like the ALS tends to attract really talented lawyers, sort of passionate lawyers, and Dubbo has this amazing history as a breeding ground basically for criminal lawyers, and that's mainly because of the ALS. So yeah, I was just basically, I had a car, had a work car, and I got my briefs and I got my trial dates, and I just drove around Western New South Wales appearing in jury trials and other criminal matters for people. And
big area.
yeah, huge. Yeah, huge. Did my first trial for the ALS out at Broken Hill, and yeah, it was a great job. And then my boss, who had been there when I got there, Nadine Miles, she left in 2012, so I moved into the principal lawyer job, which was probably the best part of my work at the ALS. I got to lead this incredible team of like 25 lawyers, and working closely with Dale Bonham and Lorraine Wright, who were like the Aboriginal managers who managed the admin staff and were ultimately our boss as well. And got to do this work at the ALS, which was such a combination of lawyering and advocacy. So we were able to take on systemic issues as
where
well.
the law and politics sort of
100%.
intersect. That's where you really got the flavour for it.
Yeah.
Because one of the things that you've raised in your inaugural speech and in Parliament is that there's some areas of, in the statutes, in our criminal code that might not need to be there around language. Indecent language is an area for Aboriginal people, like driving while disqualified, with this compounding effect of criminalising people, and minor drug use, areas where those crimes might not be fit for purpose, and maybe exacerbating some pretty serious social injustice.
Yeah. Yeah, 100%. So the one thing I really take from my ALS work that I guess I try to apply in my political work is the criminal law is so important, right? It's central to our civilization and our community, but it can be incredibly harmful and corrosive. And the criminal law over the generations has been used as a widespread tool of social oppression of Aboriginal people. And it's been used to control people, to exclude people, to repress people. And I just remember
Incarcerate people,
mass incarceration of people. And I just remember turning up in Dubbo. My main Australian criminal law experience had been in Canberra, which is relatively enlightened jurisdiction, and sitting in the local court, because I did some work in the local court, but it was a big part of my job to do appeals from the local court, but also identify strategic appeals from the local court. And a big focus of the work I did there was basically on the summary jurisdiction, because it's a bit forgotten and left behind. People often think more about, the right to a fair trial as a kind of trial thing, a jury trial thing. But I think its most important application is in the summary jurisdiction, where 95% of cases are run, and there's many more problems. But anyway, sitting in the local court.
So for a layperson, tell us what a summary jurisdiction is.
Yeah, so a matter heard in front of a magistrate in the local court, which is 95% of criminal matters, and where generally the fair trial is not as well established, and there's lots of procedural problems and resource issues. But just remember sitting there in the local court and just realising that systematically Aboriginal young people, sometimes first or second offenders, are getting jail terms for driving while disqualified. And just realising that this was being used not as some vindication of some social interest in people not driving while they're disqualified, but just as a way to churn these people in and out of jail, basically. So that was one of the...
So let's walk through that, because it's a massive issue.
Yeah.
It's been diminished.
Largely diminished, yeah.
Largely diminished because there's been a parliamentary inquiry into it, and there was a bipartisan recognition that it was utterly unjust.
And then a reduction in the maximum penalty.
Very rare in New South Wales. And with a corresponding, just like an immediate drop in the
huge drop
in incarceration. So Aboriginal people, or people generally, but were getting a speeding offence or a DUI offence, disqualified, driving again, and then ending up in jail. That's essentially it.
Yeah, or even suspended, whether because of fines or a different reason, then appearing in court, getting disqualified, then driving, so then appearing in court, sometimes for a second offence or third offence. But the first offence of drive while disqualified, which then carried a maximum penalty of 2 years, so very much a lower end, penalty, and getting jail, either getting a suspended sentence, which would set them up to fail, or just getting jailed off the bat, first or second offenders. And I just remember being horrified by it. And myself and Felicity Graham and a few other lawyers there just decided to basically mount a campaign on this. And we identified strategic cases that we got into the media. We ultimately did the parliamentary inquiry. We took up appeals in a very systematic way. But the media was the key thing. We basically used the Australian newspaper particularly, was really interested in it, and basically got a whole lot of continuous stories in the national press, ended up on Q&A being talked about at one point about the way that criminal sentencing in the summary jurisdiction is being used in and on Aboriginal communities. And ultimately a parliamentary inquiry was convened. It was actually the week that I went to Afghanistan, because I remember attending state parliament with Felicity Graham and Jane Sanders, who gave evidence, and I think I flew out the next day. But ultimately, so I was in Afghanistan on leave without pay for part of this, but ultimately the parliament recommended wholesale changes. So repeal of the habitual offender declaration that was extending disqualification periods sometimes for years and years and years. When an offence doesn't involve a threat to road safety, implementing changes there. But of most key significance, reducing the maximum penalty from 2 years to 18 months, which is significant in criminal law terms.
Forgive me if I got this wrong, but you ran a couple of cases all the way to the High Court, didn't you? What was the case for the family at Wilcannia?
So I did the William Bugmy case.
The William Bugmy case.
Yeah.
And was that related to this? Was that
No, not strictly, but it kind of came out of this kind of process of thinking that we were doing, and activism around socially disadvantaged Aboriginal people, sometimes with long criminal records, not getting those circumstances recognised properly in the sentencing process, which was something that I'd sort of observed as part of the drive disqualified stuff. But William's case turned up, and it was this sort of horrible case where he blinded a prison officer in one eye because he threw a snooker ball at him after a visit was denied. So a very tragic case for that person. But it posed these interesting legal issues around, there'd been a case called Fernando, which had been about 10 years before, where the Supreme Court had said that there are special considerations for most Aboriginal people appearing, and courts need to look closely at social disadvantage and community background in understanding why offences occur, what the purposes of sentencing are for such a person, what weight is to be given to rehabilitation, for example. It could be higher in those sorts of cases where the person's particularly disadvantaged. But that line of case law had been eroded by the courts. The courts were saying things like, oh, well, you only get that benefit once, or you only get that benefit twice, or, that someone like William, who I think was 29 at the time, was too old to get the Fernando principle. So what we took to the High Court ultimately was an appeal point saying that the Court of Criminal Appeal had erred in saying that the judge had given too much weight to William's background because William had had those discounts before, et cetera, et cetera. Our case was social disadvantage doesn't disappear because a person's been jailed before. It doesn't disappear because it's been recognised before. Indeed, it could be worse the more the person's been through the system. The person can be more excluded and more disadvantaged as a consequence of those things. And we didn't put it as a get out of jail free card. We were just putting it as, this is equality before the law. If you're going to consider, the kid from Vaucluse and all their good prospects of rehabilitation, well, in the same side, you should be considering why the Aboriginal bloke from Wilcannia is in court. You should be considering his disadvantage, because you don't get equality before the law unless you take into account everyone's circumstances. Yeah, so that case started to occur, and I got to know William's family, particularly his auntie, Julie Bugmy, who's now a good friend of mine. And, basically got wrapped up in this really...
And they're from Wilcannia, aren't they?
William was from Wilcannia, though he'd spent a lot of time in Broken Hill too. Julie's from Burke originally, but now lives in Broken Hill. Yeah, but the Bugmys are a big family in Wilcannia and Broken Hill. So yeah, I spent a lot of that time at the ALS doing this case.
But you won that.
Yeah, we won it in the High
And now
Court.
that's referred to all the time.
Yeah, Bugmy is now probably one of the most important sentencing cases, I think, and definitely it's the only authority that's a High Court authority on the sentencing of socially disadvantaged Aboriginal people.
Amazing.
Basically, yeah.
Amazing. So, winning High Court cases, defending Aboriginal people in sentencing, in fairness in sentencing. And again, because you've got nothing else to do, you decide to go to Afghanistan. What the fuck is wrong with you, man? Like, what are you doing in Afghanistan? You got a couple of medals, didn't you, for your work in the Solomons? Didn't you win a
No, I haven't got
Purple
any
Heart
medals. I've got 2 medals from Afghanistan.
from Afghanistan?
Not for doing anything particularly brave.
But not for throwing yourself on a grenade.
No, just for
or
being there.
Just for not just for being there. Just what were you doing being there?
So the reason
Stephen?
I went there was, so I went there in 2013.
Have you ever thought that maybe there's something going on where you just like you're rushing into conflicts of like there's a fight.
There's a common theme here.
There's a common theme here. There's a fight, and in the middle of it, someone trying to sort it out. So after the Solomons, Aboriginal Australia, Palestine, Afghanistan.
Afghanistan.
The great game.
Yeah.
You're there.
Yeah. So the reason I went there was a couple of years before that, I'd signed up for a thing called the Australian Civilian Corps, which was the only thing that came out of, I don't know if you remember Kevin Rudd's 2020 summit, I think it was called.
No, I do remember.
Well, the only thing that ever really came out of that was this thing called the Australian Civilian Corps, which has now been scrapped, by the way. And it was basically a standing register of Australian experts willing and able to deploy to conflict, post-conflict and natural disaster zones. So I'd signed up to that because lots of lawyers go off to post-conflict particularly, but sometimes conflict. And this opportunity came up to go to Bagram, Afghanistan, which was then an American army base north of Kabul, about 40 k's north of Kabul.
Infamous Bagram. It's very well known. It was a gigantic military complex in the middle of it was America's main Air Force base, wasn't it? And you were living in it.
Yep, living in Bagram.
In a shipping container.
In a shipping container.
Just with the odd angry shot and an occasional mortar round.
Yeah, so so the Australian government, this was under Gillard and Obama, had agreed to contribute to a thing called the Justice Centre in Parwan, which was technically an Afghan court, but sat inside Bagram, so inside the wire. And it was basically a political legal solution to the problem of about 3,000 Taliban detainees in the custody of coalition forces. And they needed a way to get them into the Afghan system because you can't just detain these people indefinitely. And, part of the coalition effort was to set up the systems of government in Afghanistan. And part of that was courts and so forth, which had existed, I should say, before. Lots of the laws we were using were decades old. But obviously Afghanistan's had all this terrible conflict and sometimes the law was not operative or whatever. So Australia agreed to contribute lawyers to this effort. And I was one of them.
And you were one of them, and you were helping like local Afghani lawyers defend the Taliban.
Yeah.
Against, pretty serious crimes, but to get them out of basically off the books of the US and the Australians.
That's right.
Wow. How did that go?
It was interesting. So we lived in this part of Bagram. Bagram was a huge place, like 20,000 people living there or something. You could drive around. It'd probably take half an hour to drive around it. But we were living in Camp Sabalu Harrison. All the little camps, I think, were named after American soldiers who'd been killed. And that consisted of a detention centre that all the Taliban were in and this court complex. And it was often said that the Taliban, I don't know if this is accurate or not, but it was often said that the Taliban would try not to hit that side of the base with their mortars because indirect fire came in quite regularly. And but we did get a few sort of in the vicinity, but I don't know how accurate those things are, but that is what was often said. And we basically trundled off to court every day, and the Americans would bring the Taliban detainees in for their trial.
Are you in civilian clothes? Or you like in?
Yeah, civilian clothes.
You're in civilian clothes.
Yeah.
You don't have all the gear on.
No. And the Afghan lawyers would come up from Kabul every day, and they were just a hilarious bunch of guys. Like, Afghan humour is very irreverent and funny and dark. And these guys would be travelling up from Kabul with the Taliban trying to kill them because they're working for the Americans. And they didn't really have a trial system in the way that we did. And again, it was this fusion of this sort of military context with this legal context. So Afghan law had all these very strong provisions about unlawfully obtained evidence, how you should obtain evidence, how long you could be detained pre-trial, none of which have been complied with. So if you applied the letter of the law, you wouldn't have run any of these trials. But in this sort of Afghan way, everyone just had to make it work. So the lawyers would make all these arguments about exclude all the evidence and let my client go. The Afghan judges would just ignore all of that and then just work out if they thought the person was guilty or not. If they thought the person was guilty or not, then they'd be convicted. And the way they, by and large, did that was they would assess the allegations and the evidence on paper, and that might include fingerprint matches, DNA matches, statements from witnesses. If that evidence on its face meant that if it was accepted that you were guilty, then that evidence would be accepted and you'd be found guilty. But what was incredibly common, probably about a third of the cases, was there was actually no allegation against this person. And some of these people would have spent 3, 4, 5 years in detention. They might, for example, have been picked up in a military raid on their village. For whatever reason, maybe someone at the scene said he's Taliban or whatever. The person had been swept up and detained. And the Americans had a lot of intelligence, so they would make their judgments about who should be detained. But that's a very different thing to having an actual clear allegation against a person.
For having done something wrong?
Actually having
Was
done
it
something
illegal
wrong.
to be in the Taliban?
Yes.
Oh, it was.
Yeah, it's a prescribed organisation.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
But that was illegal in Afghanistan then?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, it was a terrorist organisation under law. A lot of the cases were to do with IEDs, so improvised explosive devices. A lot of them related to opium as well. Remember heaps of opium cases. I remember one case which...
Any cannabis cases? Any kush?
No, I don't remember any of that, actually. But, yeah, we were sort of getting, I think, the more serious matters. I don't know if cannabis was illegal under that system, which is now gone. Yeah, I should have asked.
So terrorism and opium cultivation and trading, pretty serious matters. And you were so were many people getting off, or were most of them being farmed into jail?
So about a third would get off, and then the rest would be found guilty and sentenced. And it was an interesting thing. I remember cases where, for example, I remember one case involving a full frontal attack on an American military base. It was the biggest, can't remember the name of the base, but was the biggest, the largest amount of casualties the Marines had suffered since Vietnam. A very senior Marine officer was killed in it. And I think the only survivor of the attack was the accused, who'd been 17, I think at the time, or 18 at the time. He'd set off a hand grenade when he was captured, so he had no left or right arm. I can't remember which one. And he got sentenced to death. And I remember sitting in the court when he was sentenced to death. And obviously that was quite confronting. But the thing that really stays with me is I remember lots of other cases where people would be sentenced for IED matters. So they might be convicted with their fingerprints on 10 IEDs that had killed people. And they would get like 10 years or 15 years or 20 years, but this bloke got death. I remember just not being able to square those things.
And it's a bit of a funny one. You'd think like it's not really terrorism when it's a full frontal assault.
Exactly.
It just sounds like the rules of war should apply.
Yeah.
That you're just doing what your state, they might not recognise that state told you to do, attack.
Yeah.
Wow.
There was no exception for that in their system. In the Solomons, they'd had amnesty for people that had been engaged in true military hostilities. But in Afghanistan, I don't recall that. There wasn't any kind of notion
who carried
of legitimate
out
warfare.
the execution?
I don't think he was executed, and I don't think Hamid Karzai, who was then the president, actually allowed any of those executions to proceed because Karzai was then the president, but he had this complicated relationship with the Americans and the Taliban. And I think I'm correct in saying that since they've taken over, he's still living in Kabul and he's basically sheltered by them. And yeah, I think he had a complicated, I remember this, I'm not an expert in it, but I remember this very complicated situation where it was quite unclear where Karzai's sympathy sort of ultimately lay. So my understanding is he commuted the death penalty.
I think that was the problem with everyone in Afghanistan.
Yeah.
Everyone was going, hold on, are we getting played here? And did you ever just go for a stroll in the evenings into Kabul? Just pop out for a curry or, just go and cruise the streets?
No. So yeah, living
or
in Bagram.
Or did you hide behind the wire?
So living in Bagram.
Under your bed.
We were able to walk around the perimeter road. So there was a big fence around us. But we were not allowed to walk outside the wire. I mean, literally, people were out there shooting rockets in. It's hostile territory. And the Taliban didn't occupy that part of Afghanistan, but my understanding was their operatives were essentially anywhere, and they were shooting rockets in from only kilometres away. But when we were in Kabul, the way we got to Kabul was we'd have to file a movement request, and then we'd fly on a State Department helicopter sort of airline, if you like. And we'd fly to Kabul and we'd book a movement through the Australian Embassy. So they'd pick us up at the heli port place in an American military base in Kabul. And then they would drive us back to the embassy where we would stay. And then we'd have to book a movement from there if we wanted to go anywhere, like to a restaurant or something like that. We used to go to a Lebanese restaurant, I remember, but then that was subject of a really bad Taliban attack, where they killed scores of people in there, including the head of the World Bank in Afghanistan. So you were not safe anywhere in Afghanistan except in a Western embassy, as I remember it. Your security could not be guaranteed, basically. So it was always scary going to and from the airport, basically, because that was a pretty high-risk endeavour.
Well, I concur. It sounds like a high-risk endeavour. And you got a medal for it, didn't you? What was it? What was the medal you got for it?
We all got two medals: the Australian Operational Service Civilian Medal, and then a NATO ISAF medal. So NATO, because the whole sort of coalition operation at that point was under NATO, I think. So it was the NATO International Stabilisation Assistance Force. So we all got the NATO ISAF medal as well.
And how did
Which I feel like a bit of a fraud having medals, because I would have thought you're supposed to go and fight in a war to get a medal or something.
Well, I think you might have just done that. You're being very humble. And how did you feel when it all went to shit and it's all just been washed away and the Taliban have taken back over? Like all that work, how did you feel about that?
I remember when Kabul fell, because I got messages. I remember getting messages.
You must have had friends there.
Oh, yeah, totally. Yeah.
You must have been scared shitless, because they would have been they were clearly working for NATO or whoever.
Yep.
That's a hard thing to go and explain to the Taliban when they're coming into town.
Yeah, I mean, a lot got out. So I remember in the time I was there, a good mate of mine went to America on a State Department scholarship and didn't come back. So different people left at different times, and America got most of the lawyers and interpreters out. We had a lot of interpreters at the Justice Centre in Parwan. A lot of them had been military interpreters who then sort of ended up in JSIP, but most of them are now in the States. We, the Australian Justice Advisors, we couldn't get people onto the Australian visa program because it wasn't an Australian project. We tried at the time to get some of them out, but they basically had to go to the Americans. But some didn't get out because hadn't worked for the Americans long enough or just different reasons. And some of them are in Pakistan now, I know. And some are still in Afghanistan though. Like guys I worked with, I know are still there. But it was very, it was very, I didn't feel sad in terms of the work that I'd done, to be honest, because it never felt to me like a genuine sort of democracy and governance building project. It always seemed to me, it was a very militarized environment. It was a very military context.
And a political house of cards.
And a house of cards, mate. I mean, the lawyers were great, but they were, you could tell most of them were planning an exit strategy. And yeah, so I didn't feel sort of sadness or regret in terms of that part of it, to be honest. It was unsurprising. But mate, I feel just, I felt it was an upsetting time because, I was getting a lot of messages from those guys. A lot of them had just left, a lot left in the last week or so before Kabul fell. And I know some went to Europe, but some went to America. And mate, it's just sad for those people. Like they've just lost their country basically. And it's a little bit like the Vietnamese after the Vietnam War. You don't just become a refugee, kind of lose your country because you can't go back readily. And it's a totally different regime.
You never get over it.
Yeah, it's a huge
I was amazed
thing
to see it in Cabramatta the other day. I went out there for a meal and was just cruising around to see how many South Vietnamese flags were flying around the place. The people still just going, they're still hanging on to that and all the associated trauma. So just from one war zone to another, and no greater war zone, and in my experience, than Central West politics, the Central West of New South Wales. Forget Kabul, forget Ramallah, forget Honiara, forget domestic violence. All of it is encapsulated by Dubbo City. I was on Orange City Council, so I know what it's like. It's an absolute clown show. It's like three-dimensional chess of politics. It's a good like learning ground for politics. You run for council. Because you've been a member of the Labor Party like your entire adult life, haven't you?
No. So I joined when I was 18, but didn't stay involved for that long.
And
then rejoined in Dubbo in 2014.
So 2014, and then you decide to run for Dubbo City Council. And what fit of madness made you do that?
But it's sort of linked to Afghanistan, to be honest, because when I was in Afghanistan, I had a really good colleague, James Watson, who he'd been a military guy, he's a lawyer. He took a sort of secondment from customs to come and do the job in Afghanistan. But he's this very smart kind of guy who likes to sort of help other people and mentor people. And he just said to me, like, what are you doing with your life? Like, what are you doing with your life? You're at ALS in Dubbo. What's the plan? Like, what are you doing? Hey, like, what's the plan? And I sort of, in one of these conversations with him at the Australian Embassy in Kabul, said, I've always sort of been interested in politics. And I'd already been involved in this push to get a rehab sort of centre in Dubbo. And it was actually when I was back.
You were doing the Justice Reinvest stuff as well?
Yeah, through ALS, yeah.
So you were an activist already. You'd run some activist cases. You were making political points and pretty effectively.
Yeah, so I was back in Dubbo. I think I was on one of my 1 month breaks from Afghanistan, and a mate of mine, Sharon Thomas. So I'd sort of had this thought about sort of trying to do political stuff. And then a mate of mine came to the ALS office and said, the Labor Party's looking for a candidate for the March 2015 election. Why don't you do it? And then you can push this rehab thing that we've been campaigning for as well. And so I thought, that sounds like a good idea. And I've been talking about it with James. And so then, I rejoined the Labor Party, went to the branch meetings, put myself forward as a candidate, ran in 2015.
Oh, so you ran for you ran for the lower house.
I ran for the state seat.
Yeah, right. The state seat. Yeah, that was my entree. I ran for the seat of Orange in 2003.
Oh, that's right. You did too.
Yeah. So I ran in 2003, and then the local government election came around pretty quick. And
same. So I got a similar experience in that way.
And I had the fever, and so I was like, I like this. And you enjoyed it. You didn't mind getting your mug on the TV and getting because it's pretty robust. The politics out in the Central West,
it is.
Where people aren't. I think it's so robust because there's so many voices in there. You've got really strong independents. You've got the Nats. You've got Libs. You've got Country Labor. You've got Greens. And then, usually some other lunatics as well, like One Nation will pop up in there.
It's very diverse.
It's super diverse. And so there's a lot of moving parts to it. And some pretty serious issues out there in terms of, development, a lot of the people want control of these, of local government because there's a lot at stake. These are growth areas. They're important politically. So you went up against Troy Grant. Lost.
Lost.
But weren't deterred?
No, I wasn't deterred at all. And it was actually a really enjoyable campaign. And learned a lot.
Troy Grant was was he deputy premier then?
He wasn't at the beginning of the campaign, but he became deputy premier, I'm pretty sure, during the campaign. He became a minister.
Police minister,
I'm pretty sure
wasn't he?
that he became the deputy premier and leader of the Nats before election day. I can't remember exactly when. But I remember, people saying to me, "Oh, how are you going to beat Troy? How are you going to get any votes? He's this really important person now." So I made the centerpiece of my campaign that if I'm elected as part of a Luke Foley Labor government, I will not accept a ministry. I will be the full-time local member for Dubbo, because we're being neglected by this person, Troy Grant, who's off doing all these other important things. So I will not accept a ministry.
Clever. Localism.
Still got smashed.
Parochialism. Didn't work.
Didn't work. Anyway, so I ran in 2015, lost, and then went to the bar, left the ALS after the election, went to the private bar, and then ran for local government in 2017 and got elected to council. And
that was, how do I describe your time? You got a lot done. Like I've had a look at some of the things you got done. The council was great with a new cultural centre, really did some great work on Aboriginal employment strategy, recognition, of bringing in, like Aboriginal artefacts and these types of things. A lot of really proactive engagement there, but which I'll get you to talk about. But there was also some very, very hot politics, wasn't there?
Yeah, there was.
There was some really, and you weren't afraid of it. You were pretty proactive out there, and was you and John Ryan versus Ben Shields?
That's how it turned out. Yeah, I mean, the defining thing that I suppose like to highlight about my time on council is I really worked hard to get a majority of the council to support a formal allocation of resources to campaign for a rehab centre, for a drug court and a youth query court. And all those things got achieved. And I know for a fact, particularly the rehab and the drug court, they wouldn't have happened without the campaign that we led through the council. And we managed to mobilise all these community members, organisations, using the power of the council, basically. So that's my most proudest.
So tell us about a drug court, because we've got one just down the road here. There wasn't one in Dubbo.
Yeah.
So what is it, and why did you need one in Dubbo?
Look, it's basically a court that is available for persons accused of relatively serious matters where a term of imprisonment is on the cards. The court, when you enter the program, essentially gives you a suspended sentence. So you've got this jail term hanging over your head, but you then enter a lengthy and extended program of residential rehabilitation, engagement with support services. If you pass the drug court program, then you don't ultimately go to jail. And that was the program that I really wanted for Dubbo. A key part of it is a rehab centre, which we've got the funding for and should be open next year in Dubbo. And that will make the drug court that is already operating operate better. But the council led the charge for that. And that was something that I was able to basically get through because myself and John Ryan ended up caught between these two conservative factions, between the Liberals and the Nats effectively. And we're able to basically do a deal with the Liberals, Ben Shields, to get his support for all of those things and really turn council in a progressive direction. And we did a lot of good stuff. And Ben, for his faults, he was a brave operator in the sense that he wasn't scared to cause problems for the state government, wasn't scared to demand resources and funding. And we got a lot of stuff done during that council. We got big allocation of state resources and ultimately got those really important programs.
Yeah, because I've always said this about the Central West and especially Dubbo. It's got there's a lot of people look down their noses at the Central West and Dubbo, and I just see it as such a beautiful place, such an incredible natural environment, rivers, there's just boundless plains. You live there. It's a magnificent place, great climate. And it's got the potential to be just such a big, vibrant, beautiful regional centre if some of these problems around resourcing and crime and are dealt with. But and you saw that opportunity too.
Yep, 100%. Part of my political strategy was to really deal front and centre with the issue of crime and say to people we are suffering from entrenched high crime rates, and there's one reason for it: entrenched social problems. And you can't arrest your way out of them. You can't lock up your way out of them. you've got to deal with the social problems. And we don't even have a drug rehab centre, and that is a complete disgrace. So that was something that I just kept hammering and hammering and hammering in each of the elections that I ran, which was the 2015 election, the 2017 local government election, and then the 2019 state election. I ran again, and we ended up getting, after the 2019 election, Dougal Saunders got elected, the LNP government continued, and we got those big commitments off Perrottet, basically, which was awesome.
And it shows how important Dubbo is, that the Nats have, made their leader. That they've picked their leader. That's how important.
Twice in recent times.
Times. It's a pivotal battleground in regional politics. So you're on the council, and then you decide to run for the Legislative Council. Well, how did you navigate that? Because it's pretty. It's a minefield of. I don't know how the Labor Party does, but it's a combination of union delegates and rank and file members all get together. So you must have had some pretty good links in with the union movement and built some strong relationships. Had some people in the party backing you. How did you find yourself as a candidate for the Legislative Council with some pretty strong support?
Yeah, it's a sort of complicated story, but I'd run twice for state. I was on council. I'd served as the mayor in 2021.
That's right. I forgot to say that. The mayor.
Yeah, and basically the Labor Party I'm trying to remember when it was. It was during COVID. It must have been 2021. We changed our party rules to provide a number of different things about country representation, including that a third of the winnable spots on the upper house ticket would be reserved for country residents. So that was a big part of why I was in play, I guess. I've been a union member for a long time, but I didn't have a long association with a particular union. So I didn't kind of have that advantage in the pre-selection process, I suppose. I didn't come out of a particular union, and you see lots of people in the Labor Party who have. But there had to be country people on the ticket, and I'd been a candidate before. I'd been on council. And what I did that was sort of unusual was because normally the upper house ticket is determined by the sort of party internally as part of a pre-selection process. And you're absolutely right. The unions are half of the delegates, so half the numbers are union delegates, half are branch member delegates. But I decided, because I tend to do these crazy things, to run a public campaign for my pre-selection for the upper house. So I changed my Facebook name to Stephen Lawrence for the upper house, and I rang up head office and I said, just letting you guys know that I'm going to run a public campaign, and I'm going to go around to all the branches and speak to the branch members, did radio interviews about it, threw them up on my page. But mainly I travelled around to many, many of the country branches, and then ultimately got invitations to city branches as well. So I went to the Balmain branch where there wasn't really any votes sort of at play for me, but and it is very much an internal kind of complicated process, but I just wanted to play it that way. I wanted to do it in a way that was focused on the branch members, not just on sort of factional power plays or anything like that. And I don't know if anyone in sort of recent times has done it like that. Anyway, so that's what I did. So I went around to many, many of the country branches and just introduced myself, said I'm, standing for the upper house, et cetera. And, like any political party, the Labor Party's got factions and it's got powerful people internally that are going to be very influential, and no single branch members necessarily going to have much influence in that context. But that's how I did it, and somehow I got through.
Well, you travelled and worked hard, mate. It's a consistent theme. You still are. Now you're in the upper house. You're a country member. We remember. A good country member. And you're doing the work. You're always, when I see you're out in Broken Hill, Wagga Wagga, all over the place. You're a duty MLC. What's your region? It's probably about the size of the Ukraine.
Yeah, most of the state. So the electorates of Orange, Bathurst, Barwon, Dubbo and Cootamundra. I'm the duty MLC for them, which, it's one of those roles that you decide basically how much you do because it's an endless amount of work.
Yeah.
But there's lots of government events to attend as a representative. So whether it's opening of infrastructure or just events that the government's invited to. So I do a lot of that, go to a lot of the branches out there and do political work. A big part of my focus is trying to get people from the Labor Party elected onto councils. I think that's terribly important for the future of the party. And if you look at it historically, we are at a low point, I think, in country New South Wales in terms of our vote. And I believe that we can build that back. In Dubbo, we've certainly started to build it back. And as these big regional cities and communities become more diverse and expand and diversify in different ways, I think our vote has to start going back up, but we need to do the work to make that happen. So that's a big part of my role.
Yeah, I've known some good country Labor MPs. The late Glenn Taylor, he was a mentor of mine.
Yep.
He had the best turns of phrase. He'd always get up and say, I bet London to a brick. And he'd say, if there's a gap, I'll run through it. He had all these great sort of turn of the century sayings, and was really stood his dig as he and Jeff Whitten out there on Orange City Council.
Yep.
Very good friends of mine and good members. Now, since you've been in the upper house, you've been working hard. You've been outspoken on a few issues. One thing that I picked up in your inaugural speech I thought was particularly interesting was your it was not explicit, but it was implicit, was your belief that Labor has to stay focused on the big social justice, socio-economic issues. That some of the issues that have been at the fore more recently relating to particular minorities or particular issues are important, but the Labor Party can't lose its focus. And dare I say it's not a criticism of woke politics, but it's just that it might be I'm putting words in your mouth, but it might be that focus takes the attention off some of the more critical issues to more people. Am I
that was definitely a thread in my inaugural speech. I didn't sort of identify what particular issues I thought might have had too much prominence, but I wanted to put in there that I have this perspective, I guess, that identity politics is a substitute for real politics in a lot of ways, and it can be quite pernicious. And I think there's a reason why big corporates love identity politics so much. It's because it doesn't speak to how much their tax rate should be.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Yeah.
How they should be treating their workers, or who's doing their catering, or
It can be a real diversion. I mean, that said, I'm a very big supporter of everyone having their rights, and a lot of what might be considered to be woke or political correctness is just how I conduct myself and how I think people should conduct themselves. But, from the point of view of a political party, you can't focus too much on that stuff because ultimately that's not the main game, I think.
Yeah, I think it's a really important point. One that I, totally concur with. I was saying it for a long time around the issue of climate change. I was going, if this is the existential crisis that's going to undermine everything, like our entire biosphere, we've got to prioritise it, especially when I was in the Greens and we were a small political party, and other people weren't giving it the attention I thought it needed. Now I think it's changed a bit because, I think it's a very centrist position to be pro-climate. But you've also in Parliament been very concerned about the issue in Israel and Palestine, and how it's manifested itself in our political discourse, in some of the laws that we've had to deal with, the proposed laws that we've been dealing with in New South Wales, and that is increased penalties for hate speech, and more recently a real, how would we describe it, rush into some changes around 93Z and new laws about inciting racial hatred. I don't want to get you into trouble. I know you've got to tread carefully because you're bound by the rules of your party and caucus. But in your words, what have your concerns been, and how do you feel about some of the laws that we've recently passed?
Yeah, look, these laws, like I suppose all laws, are political decisions. So a lot of different things go into them. And as a member of caucus, I've submitted myself to that political process. So, once the caucus makes a decision about a law, then I'll publicly support that and I'll advocate for it. And I've done that consistently, whether it's, bail reforms or whether it's laws like this that I may or I may not have said things in caucus on, because caucus is confidential. But what I've always tried to do, and I try and do this in my speeches in Parliament, is I try to be what I think is truthful and accurate about what laws will or won't do. And one of the themes that I quite commonly will express in speeches on criminal law is we really need to be clear and thoughtful about what this law is actually going to do. If we think, for example, that passing more stringent bail laws is going to reduce crime or reduce the incidence of a particular crime, concern about which has led to the change to bail, well, frankly, I don't see any evidence for that proposition if you go back over the years and look at bail reforms. So I'll stand up in Parliament and say that, right? If we're passing hate speech laws and that's said to be justified by a particular event or something like that, then I'll try and look at that and analyse that and think about that. But I have tried to do it in a way that is transparent, in the sense that I'll stand up and say, look, these are political decisions. Lots of different things go into it. The caucus has made a decision. I support that decision. But here's what I think about some key issues, And I'll often say in these criminal law speeches, like, it's a really bad thing if the community is misled about the potential effect of this law.
Yeah, like you're looking down the road at the potential outcome.
Yeah.
So we've set this course. That's where we're heading. We may not reach that objective in the way that, these laws are designed. And so, that's a really interesting point. Another area that we've worked on, and we've got to get to this, is in drug law reform, in especially cannabis law reform. We've been working together through the inquiry into the regulatory framework for cannabis in New South Wales. I think pretty constructively, and I've really benefited from your insights into, what's achievable in terms of politically now, because that's like my political party would love us just to legalise cannabis. But we recognise, well, what does that mean?
Yeah.
What does legalise cannabis mean in terms of the law as it is and where we're going, and how do we bring other political parties with us? So I've very much appreciated your collaborative approach and your knowledge in that space. Firstly, what was your experience working with ALS with cannabis, and why was it particularly problematic for our First Nations people? And the approach that we're settling in on is a sort of depenalisation approach. And I'll just pack all these questions in. And you've just been on a gigantic study tour around the world. So just walk us through those three things over the next 45 minutes, mate. What was the experience with cannabis out in the bush?
Yep.
Depenalisation, your trip around the States.
Mate, my experience with the legal regulation of cannabis in Western New South Wales when I was at ALS, and I don't think a lot's changed, is it's one of those good examples of how the system will punish the weakest the hardest, right? So I remember doing an appeal.
That is a great quote. Did you just make that up?
I've said it before.
Jesus, a ripper.
I probably wasn't the first person that said it.
Really? So I've never heard it before. The system will punish the weakest the hardest.
Oh, well, that's the tendency that I've noticed in the criminal law.
That should be a bumper sticker. Write that down.
Yeah, but I remember this case I did, which ended up being reported by the local ABC. So it's online in part, but was a young kid. I can't remember how old he was. He might have been 14 or 15, who had been stopped and searched by the police outside a drug dealer's house and found with a tenner of cannabis. And Felicity Graham and Rebecca Mitchell, I think maybe, were involved in the local court hearing. And the issue in the appeal court ended up the admissibility of the fruits of this search, which turned on whether it was a lawful search or not. And these really good lawyers in the local court have basically subpoenaed all the police records, right? for every time this kid had been searched. And bear in mind, every police search is not necessarily recorded in COPS, which is their information management system. Anyway, I can't remember how many times this kid had been searched in the preceding year or two, but it was something like 30, 40 sort of times. And eventually they got him with a tenner of cannabis. And just a little example of the way that this law is used in a way that isn't really about the regulation of cannabis.
It's about the regulation of a particular class of person.
Yeah. And that's something that you might recall I've raised in the inquiry quite a bit in terms of the way that these drug laws can be used for other policing purposes. But yeah, I would say that...
And the same applies to like language too, indecent language.
Yeah, offensive language.
I can say fuck right now and no one's going to kick in the door, or I'm not going to get, the police come and knock on my door and arrest me. And yet...
People, when I was at ALS, were getting prosecuted for saying fuck to police officers, which is just a ludicrous way. And then
arrested, and then
they resist, and the trifecta occurs.
And that's right, and they spit at someone or
they
say
end up
something.
in jail.
They end up in jail, and then they get out and they're criminalised and they're a bad hombre, and they're on that conveyor belt into a whole heap of bad outcomes. The same with cannabis.
And the smoking of cannabis in different places among different people in Western New South Wales is, I think, really common. And it's called Yandi by some people, by Aboriginal people, and it's a criminal offence, the existence of which I think unnecessarily criminalises a whole lot of people, leading to down the track consequences that can be highly damaging to them and to society. So that's my observation from my time at ALS. It's been really good to be involved in this committee because I think we're really getting to the nub of it, and I think we're going to do a really good final report. But yeah, you're right. Our interim report very much focused on what can be done in the here and now that is politically possible within the framework of election commitments that the Premier made. And so we settled upon a whole suite of things that would basically, I think, lift that oppressive kind of hand of the criminal law in most respects. So much more diversions, much more cautions, reducing the maximum penalty from 2 years to a fine, which is how it is in Victoria. So it's not a revolutionary proposal. I don't think much has changed in Victoria as a consequence of that.
Lifting some of those quantities about...
Lifting the quantities, not allowing or not having these presumptions in law of supply at an inappropriately low level.
Yeah, deemed supply
and stuff. Changes to police powers to stop police searching on the mere suspicion of possession of cannabis or possession of a small quantity of an illicit drug. So I think it was a really good suite of recommendations that came out of it, and I think that it is quite doable. And one of the good things about committee work is sort of gives me a legitimate and proper, I suppose, forum and basis to express views about these matters. And I ultimately wrote an op-ed in the Herald saying that, the decriminalisation of cannabis is inevitable. It's going to happen. And I sort of felt like my place on that committee meant that I sort of have a legitimate, proper basis to go around expressing those opinions, because it's an issue before the committee that we're going to have to decide.
It is, and it's an issue the society's going to have to decide, informed by the evidence and informed by people who've taken the time to avail themselves of all the, multifaceted elements of all those issues. And that's what you're doing through the inquiry, and that's what you've just done on your cannabis tour of North America. Yep. You come back with your memory intact, looking like your hedonic tone has been lifted.
Yep.
You've gone above and beyond. I've been to the States, but I haven't been there like touring cannabis. You went to the States.
Yeah, I went to Thailand first.
Yep,
and then to the States and Canada.
Walk us through it.
Yeah, it was really, really interesting. I remember it all. Yep, I remember it all.
Thailand.
Yeah, so Thailand.
Because Thailand's like, the example of Thailand was, they'd hang you for it. And now it's like as legal as garlic.
Yep.
And it's just this gigantic industry.
Yep.
What was your experience?
So my experience was, and I'd heard a few things about Thailand and cannabis before I went, like, oh, it's out of control and it's everywhere. And I must say that wasn't really my experience walking around there. Like, there's definitely your fair share of cannabis shops, but I didn't think they were on every corner or anything. And I actually remember observing less public consumption of cannabis in Thailand than, for example, in like New York or something like that. I don't remember walking around in Bangkok and Chiang Mai and smelling it being smoked or whatever. And I think the Thais they sort of have a culture of, I don't know, just sort of discretion, and it's a pretty low key sort of place, you know. You don't see people sort of wandering around drunk, and I didn't see people wandering around stoned or smoking it in public or whatever. But I went to a cannabis farm in Bangkok. I met with a whole lot of different people, met with some retailers up in Chiang Mai. And yeah, my general impression was, the sky hasn't fallen in.
And because there was like this liberalisation, legalisation, they've gone to a full retail adult use market.
Yep.
Then there was some political pushback. It became a key part of the most recent like, national elections. But then that in itself has been wound back.
I had some discussions about that because I was sort of curious about it. I think it was the Shinawatra sort of aligned people that talked about it. But the people I spoke to basically said it was never going to happen and it's not going to happen.
I think one of what I heard was that one of the elements that really came out of the woodwork in support of maintaining a legalisation regime were the property sector.
Interesting.
The people who post-COVID had all these retail outlets and all this real estate that was empty, unleased. The cannabis has been legalised. It's helped fill up some of these empty shops, signed leases, doing business. You know, they're in the supply chain for a whole range of things other than cannabis, a key part of the economy. And then they were saying, well, look, this is now a multi-billion-dollar industry that's, you know, supporting all kinds of different people. If you recriminalise it, all this goes away.
Yep.
And I think there was a bit of pushback there. So then you've gone to the States.
Yep.
Which
States and Canada. So I went to Canada first, went to Montreal and then to Ottawa. And then
which is the capital of Canada.
The capital, yeah. It was very, very cold. We were in there in January. You're talking like minus 30 or something, minus 25.
Doesn't everyone just, I've never been there, doesn't everyone just get around like in tunnels under the ground, like moles? How do you survive in minus 30 degrees?
Yeah, mate, it's interesting. It's kind of doable. And it's interesting. I don't know how temperatures really work, but the difference between minus 5 and minus 20 is not as significant as you would think. But yeah, it was bloody cold. But yeah, so I had lots of interesting meetings there, particularly with, had some government meetings, but also got a lot of really good assistance from, I can't remember their name right now, but it's like the peak body basically of cannabis growers. And they were really, really helpful to me and took me around to all sorts of places, including in Montreal. Went to a farm outside Montreal and basically saw this previously economically depressed community that had basically been rejuvenated by this really industrial scale cannabis farm that had been established there.
Have they focused on First Nations there as much? Because I think in the States, in New York and places like that, they're with their licensing and they're sort of proactive. What they've been pushing for is for like disadvantaged communities that might have been losers in terms of the war on drugs to be the first in line when it came to benefiting from potentially a new industry. Are they doing that in Canada or did you see that?
I asked a question about that at one of the visits I did, and the people said that they sort of endorsed that theory, but they didn't think that that was a huge part of it. They certainly did talk about people that had been illicit growers under the previous regime, and they said that most of them, even the ones that had tried under the legal regime, hadn't sort of lasted the distance basically. Which I think might be because of, I mean, it's actually, as you would know better than me, but it's to do it properly under these legal regimes is a complex farming and commercial operation, basically, which not everyone's going to be capable of doing it in a profitable and sustainable way. But yeah, I certainly endorse that theory. And as we move towards it, I certainly hope that we go down that route practically.
Canada's a sort of similar socio-economic, and got a similar economy. It's got it's part of the Commonwealth. It's got similar legal structures. Is it working? Is there pushback? Are the conservative forces saying this has been a disaster? Canada, will never be the same. We need to wind this back. Is there any political blowback at all?
I didn't discern any of that, and everyone I spoke to the contrary, basically said, this significant social reform has happened. It's not going to be reversed. The one issue that, and it's sort of the main issue that came out of my trip in a way in terms of the paper that I've got to do, I got some really strong feedback and sort of evidence for the proposition that they were so careful in the way they decriminalised that they haven't managed to eliminate the black market. So they haven't been able to get the distribution and price settings right, basically, to eliminate the black market. So I think in Canada, it's kind of 60-40, 50-50 in terms of the black market. And the strong message I was getting from the growers and the retail people, and, they obviously have an interest in this, was when you guys go down this path in Australia, don't unnecessarily err on the side of caution in terms of point of sale restrictions, high taxation, stopping brands being advertised properly. Don't err too much on the side of caution, because you won't get rid of the black market if you do. If it's too expensive, if it's not
overregulated,
if it's overregulated,
people will just go, look, I don't have to fill out these forms if I'm doing it the way I've always done it. Okay.
And that defeats the whole point of the reform, basically. You want to get rid of the black market. You want the state to be getting the revenue. You want people to be getting a product that's safe, and you don't want people engaging in criminal conduct.
And did you find the product safe?
I did not try the product. I didn't.
Didn't?
No. I'm not. I've smoked marijuana in the past, but no. Like, I was over there with my family, and it's not really part of my life. That I'm not a virgin, that's for sure.
Really?
But
okay, fair enough. I was just intrigued. And then you went to the States, because the States got it's 38 states are doing it 38 different ways. There's a push for federal deregulation, which we don't know where that's going now that, Trumpy Doodle's in charge. He's made noises about, supporting legalisation. He supported the Florida ballot on it recently, which was just unsuccessful. But you went to New York?
Yeah, I went to DC first.
DC?
Yep, went to DC, which was interesting. And they've still got these sort of gifting shops. Have you heard about those? Where to get around the complicated sort of criminal statute. They're on the verge of reform, I think, but to get around the complicated criminal statute.
Is DC a state? It is actually.
It's like like the ACT.
It's like the ACT.
Yeah, I don't know if it's exactly on all fours.
But it's got its own laws. It's got its own laws.
Yeah, it's got a local parliament.
Yeah.
But they've still got this situation where you, I think, basically can't buy cannabis, but they've construed the legislation in a way that you go there and buy something else, which might be a little sticker or a symbol or a shirt, and then they gift you the cannabis. Oh. So it started to change. They've just changed the regulation, I think, but gifting shops are very much sort of still part of the the setup over there. But again, it's just a modern city with
it's just another
going
part
about their thing, and society to me doesn't seem to be changed in any fundamental way at all.
What about New York? Because I haven't been there since it was legalised, and people say, oh, you go there and everyone's smoking everywhere, and the subway's full of weed smoke, and it's like there's an element that people are saying it's like a bit antisocial.
There's definitely more of it around there. Like, if you walk around New York, you'll very commonly smell it. But I must say, I don't find that offensive particularly. I mean, in the same way that if I'm walking down the street and someone's got alcohol in their breath, or I manage to get a whiff of that doesn't particularly trouble me either. And so this idea that people are smoking marijuana cigarettes in public, that doesn't really bother me, to be honest. But I suppose some people might have a different view, and they might think it's normalising something. And obviously use by children is a really important issue. So we need to think about those things. But I didn't find it prevalent to some antisocial or concerning degree, I must say, but definitely more prevalent.
And in terms of that prevalence, are there shop fronts or mobile dispensaries?
Heaps of shops in New York.
Heaps of shops.
Heaps of them. I went into heaps of them and spoke to people and got their kind of views about stuff. And really, really interesting.
And any pushback? Again, is there any political pushback, like at a state or federal level, where they're saying, look, this could all go away soon because there's a particular lobby group or interest group or political group that's targeting it?
Not that I picked up. There might be small minority voices who are calling for recriminalisation, but I don't think it's a significant push. I went to Denver as well, Colorado, which I think was one of the first states to legalize. And I had lots of conversations there, and I picked up absolutely no push to recriminalise. I think it's a reform that once you do it, and it becomes part of the furniture, and people would immediately recognise the absurdity of wanting to criminally prosecute someone for smoking a joint at home.
Well, Stephen, that is a great note to finish this podcast, Into the Weeds. I've got to say, actually, before we do finish, you've got your own podcast, which I had to listen to, which is fantastic, The Wigs.
The Wigs.
For lay people who are not barristers and SCs and the rest, it's a really good podcast to come to a better understanding of how the courts work. What are the principles of law that are really important? What are some of the issues that have bubbled up recently? I mean, you got in a bit of shit for your Wigs podcast because you were basically, during the Black Lives Matter, weren't you suggesting that we may not all need to get vaccinated? What was the issue?
No. So with the Black Lives Matter, so that big protest at Town Hall was it 2020? So the three people the three barristers in the podcast, Emmanuel Kirkashari and Felicity Graham and I, we all appeared in that case.
Oh, you appeared
we
in
all
the
appeared
case.
in that case. And we then did an episode about appearing in that case. And the Sydney Morning Herald then did a story about it. And that sort of took our podcast up. Like we were the top rating in the country for a few days or for about a week after that.
The Wigs.
But that sort of jumped us up a bit. Yeah, and it was very sort of high profile.
Because you were arguing that the protest should go ahead.
Yeah, correct.
And the courts found in your favour.
The courts found in our favour. Yeah, it was a sort of technicality. Was an issue in New South Wales under the Summary Offences Act that governs the authorisation of protests, which is a bit of unfortunate language because you don't need authorisation to have a protest, but if you get it, it gives you immunity from certain summary offences like blocking a road or something. That authorisation hinges on an application having been made to the police and the police not having obtained a contrary order from the court after getting the application. So the way that we won that case was basically we persuaded the appeal court that our application that we'd lodged with the police was a valid application, whereas the lower court had said that it wasn't. So the effect of that was that because the police hadn't obtained a contrary order, then the protest was authorised. But we got that order, I think at 10 minutes to 3. Protest meant to start at 3, and there was already 20,000 people at Town Hall. So it was this amazing case where the kind of judges handed down the decision. It was immediately communicated to the protest and read out by David Dungay's family over the loudspeaker. The protest authorised, and all the police sort of disappeared because all these police were there, were planning apparently to try to break it up and end it. And so a rare example of being involved in a court case that has a very immediate effect, literally within 10 minutes.
Well, you have had an immediate effect pretty much everywhere you've gone in your life, mate. To quote Tex Perkins, you better get a lawyer, son. You better get a real good one. You are, mate. You've been a fantastic advocate for all the people that you've defended and for the causes that you've prosecuted. I very much appreciate you paying attention on the cannabis law reform issue. You're going to be a key ally in that. You've packed a lot into your 50 years. I'm sure you're going to pack a lot more into the next 50. But Stephen Lawrence, more strength to your arm, and thank you so much for coming into the weeds, mate.
I've really enjoyed it, mate. It's been an honour, and good on you for all the amazing work you do.
Thanks very much, Stephen. Remember, folks, like, subscribe, share. See you in the next edition.